Do you struggle to make adjustments halfway through your fishing day when your initial game plan fails? This is a very common problem anglers face on the lake, and in this video, I'm going to explain how I make audibles on the lake to adapt to changing conditions and put fish in the boat when things aren't going to plan when I have a very limited amount of time to fish. Let's get into it. A few days ago, I made a trip out to Beaver Lake. It was early January and water temperatures were between 43 and 45 degrees. Usually in January, you're going to be able to find a lot of fish setting up in the middle of creek channels and drains, suspended out in the middle chasing bait fish. Because Beaver Lake has relatively clear water, bass can suspend in 20 to 40 feet of water over 60 to 80 feet of water and just chase shad randomly. If you can get on the right school, you can load the boat quickly, so it's worth graphing for these fish. My initial game plan was to start in the back half of 3 or 4 major creeks and just graph around in the middle with my side imaging, down imaging, and 2D sonar. Right off the bat in my first area, I started seeing baitfish suspended 10 to 20 feet down over 40 to 60 feet of water. I was graphing in the very center of a creek and I was about halfway back into this major creek. The water visibility was pretty good, but I really wasn't seeing any fish suspended out in the middle, just a lot of shad. This is actually relatively common when I'm graphing for fish out in the middle. You'll oftentimes find creeks that are loaded with shad, but don't have very many fish around them. I would see one fish here or there, but not groups of fish. Usually I'm looking for maybe 5 or 6 fish grouped somewhat tight together underneath those bait balls on my 2D sonar and down imaging. I wasn't too worried though, because I knew that if I found a spot that had the fish underneath the bait, I could load the boat very quickly. So I started running more creeks on the same section of the lake. Unfortunately though, after graphing the back of 4 major creeks and spending 2 hours graphing, I never found any suspended bass around the bait. Moreover, I wasn't really finding any bait fish in the back of the other creeks, which was very weird given the time of year we were in. Whenever I need to make an audible on the lake, I like to take a step back and look at all of the conditions that are affecting the lake on that day at a macro scale, and also look at all of the pieces of information I've gathered over the past few hours of fishing. Based on what I've already seen on the lake, I can tell that 1, there are not a lot of bass that are suspended out in the middle of the lake, and also the bait fish are suspended relatively high in the water column, let's say 20 feet or less from the surface. This is a little bit different from what I was expecting, and I was hoping to find bait fish sitting a little bit deeper. And I wanted to kind of figure out why those bait fish were suspended so high. So I pulled up the Deep Dive app and started breaking down the lake based on the data that was available in the app. First thing I looked at was the water level and current flow. We'd had some rain recently, and I was thinking that the lake level or the current could be affecting these fish that were out in the middle of the lake. Sure enough, I noticed that the water had been rising steadily over the past week, and even during this fishing day, the water was coming up at a pretty good clip, especially for January. This insight about the rising water levels and the fact that I saw most of the bait fish pretty high in the water column led me to think that these fish may have pushed shallower because of all of the recent rains. To test this theory, I needed to find a place where the bass could ambush bait fish in that 10 to 20 foot zone, but that was also close to relatively deep water. We're still dealing with cold water temperatures, 43 to 45 degrees, so the bass aren't going to want to set up right up against the bank in a flat, shallow pocket. Instead, they're going to want to have access to deep water close by in case the temperatures drop and we get some bad weather. But because the bait fish were so high in the water column and the water was rising, they're going to want to feed a little bit shallower. In my experience in the winter, the best thing to look for in this situation are flat points that extend out into the lake that drop off sharply into a channel. I identified several of these around Beaver Lake using my contour map, but I wanted to narrow down the number of points I was going to look at by looking at one other factor in the Deep Dive app, and that's the wind effects map. Whenever you're dealing with fish any time of the year, the wind can be a key factor in triggering those fish to bite and activating their feeding mode. What I'm looking for on this wind effects map are basically areas where the wind is hitting directly into one of these long flat points. The way that the app calculates these wind effects is basically the distance the wind travels over the body of water plus the wind direction and the actual topography or contours of the land around the lake. It will then give a calculation as to how strong the wind is actually impacting a shoreline. As you can see here, this point I pulled up has these red areas on it, which is basically very high wind effects. So I knew that this area was getting hit strongly by the wind, which should be activating the bait fish, as well as activating those bass and making them a little more aggressive. After identifying one of those long tapering points that dropped in the channel that was also being hit by strong wind, I went over to that area and graphed it with my side imaging.
Now I will say that the fish I found on these points were very difficult to see on my traditional electronics, and I feel like a lot of anglers would completely miss these fish if they graphed over these same spots. You can very easily see the brush piles that I graphed on side imaging, however the fish don't really show up that well on the side scan view. We have to switch over to down imaging to actually see a few fish that are setting up around these brush piles, though they're very hard to spot. The fish I'm seeing are actually sitting very tight to the bottom, and they're not grouped up in a large wad of fish of like 10 or 15 dots. Instead, they're setting up very close to the bottom and roaming around the brush piles. Based on my experience, even though I'm only seeing 1 or 2 dots in each of these images, it's likely there are more fish there because a lot of them are so tight to the bottom you can't see them. So the best way to approach these areas is to look for spots with brush piles with a few dots scattered around the point, then get up with your forward-facing sonar and start casting around the area looking for small wolf packs that might be suspended up off the bottom or they're setting up tighter to the bottom.
Almost immediately, I started seeing isolated wolf packs of 3 to 4 bass that were setting up around these points. In addition, they were pretty close to those brush piles, but not really in the brush piles. My theory is that if the wind wasn't hitting this spot so hard, those bass would probably be setting up in those brush piles and would be harder to catch. But because of the wind, they were roaming around this point and away from the brush, making them a lot easier to target with a suspending jerkbait. First cast over there, I hook up into a really nice 3-pound spotted bass to get my day started. This is a great momentum builder because I'd gone 2 hours without getting a single bite. Nice one. On the jerkbait here, saw these fish actually around a brush pile, and then they started suspending up, and there were 3 of them grouped together, 3 good ones. One over here. Oh, there we go. Got my glove all wet, but that's the fish we've been looking for right there. Beautiful, big old spotted bass. After landing that really nice 3-pound spotted bass, I wanted to check another point that was on the opposite side of this little pocket that again was a long tapering point that dropped off sharply into the channel that was being impacted a little bit by the wind. The main difference between the first point I fished and the second point though is that this point had a lot less wind on it than the first one, so I wasn't expecting the fish to be as aggressive or roaming as much on this point. Sure enough, as I got over there and dropped the live scope, I noticed 3 or 4 nice fish suspended just off the point over deeper water. I picked up a Damiki rig, fired it over there, and caught another 2 3/4 pound spotted bass. Got him. There we go. Damiki rig this one, but another one off this point here. Another secondary point, another nice fish. Damiki rig on one, jerkbait on the other. We are figuring it out, guys. Another big spotted bass too. Oh, there we go, big spotted bass on the old Damiki rig. This again was an area that had some brush around it, but instead of those fish setting up directly in the brush, they were still somewhat roaming around because the wind was hitting that area, just not as strong as it was on that first point. If there was no wind at all, again, I think those fish may have pushed right up into those brush piles, but because there was just enough wind to get them a little bit active, they were suspended out a little bit off that point and were in perfect range for that Damiki rig. By adapting to the current lake conditions with the rising water levels, as well as the strong winds we had on this fishing day, I was able to make an audible and put 2 really nice fish in the boat. I wasn't able to fish for that much longer after catching those 2 fish, but it was great making an audible based on the current conditions and putting some nice fish in the boat. If I was able to fish for another 3 or 4 hours, I think I would have been able to catch several more nice fish like this after finding similar areas. One of the other things I found that was interesting on this fishing trip is that I brought a lot of different fishing poles with me on the deck of the boat. I actually even put some away since that trip because I had like 8 or 9 rods out, but I kept on picking up 2 rods in particular. And that was a deep diving jerkbait, this Spro Mix Stick +1, and a Demiki rig. This is a 3/8 ounce 4x4 tackle ball head with a Megabass Hasdong. It's a little fluke style bait. For whatever reason, over the last 2 years, I found myself reaching for these two baits more than any other baits when I'm fishing in January and February in my area. I think it's just because these baits are so efficient at covering the offshore structure I like to fish. With a jerkbait, I can target those fish that are suspending anywhere from 0 to 15 feet of water. This bait will dive anywhere from, let's say, I don't know, 6 feet to 10 feet of water. And I also weight it with an extra split ring on the front hook hanger to allow me to weight that bait down just a little bit. To get some extra depth out of the bait, I also pair that with some 10-pound Sunline FC Sniper fluorocarbon, which is a little bit lighter than I usually throw on a bait caster. And I also pair that with a 7-foot medium power moderate action crankbait rod, the Nolly Lithium Pro lineup. This little bit longer rod allows me to cast that bait a little bit further and get it down to depths that allow it to, again, fish for those suspended fish that are a little bit deeper on those offshore areas. Usually I can pull the fish 5 to 10 feet up in the water column to come eat this bait, so it's effective a lot of times all the way out to 20 feet of water. However, after you get into that like 25 to 40 foot range, this bait doesn't have enough drawing power to bring those fish in, and that's where the Demiki rig comes in. I'm throwing a pretty heavy Demiki rig here. This is a 3/8 ounce ball head, which is great when you're trying to target fish like the one I caught off that point that are roaming and suspended in deeper water. That 3/8 ounce head falls very quickly and allows you to get that bait down to the fish before they roam away from your boat. I haven't found that I actually get less bites or anything by going to this heavier head, and at times I feel like I actually get more bites because of the fast fall from this Demiki rig. Initially I was throwing a 3/16 and a 1/4 ounce head a lot, but found that I was more efficient and was having better success with that 3/8 ounce head and that little small 4-inch bait. I honestly don't think that the trailer you put on this Demiki rig really matters all that much. There's a bunch of different trailers I've tried. I just have confidence in this one. I really like the way it looks, but I don't think that that's the key really in this rig. I think it's just the ability to get that bait right in front of those fish and get it down there before they swim away from the boat. I'll pair my Demiki rig with this little bit heavier head on a little bit stouter rod. This is a Denali Lithium Pro 7'4" medium heavy fast action multi-purpose spinning rod. So it's a 7'4" rod, has a little bit more backbone, and allows me to fish that 3/8 ounce head a little bit more efficiently. I'll pair that with some 15-pound Sunline braided line for my main line, and then an 8-pound Sunline FC Sniper fluorocarbon leader. Between these two baits, I feel like I can target pretty much every single fish that I need to when I'm on the lake, as long as they're suspended. There are a few other baits I have tied on here that I'm going to start experimenting with just to kind of give you guys a little peek behind the curtain of what I'm thinking about. I have, a football jig, which is always a good option, though I haven't really got that many fish on a football jig in January and February the last few years. And I'm also thinking about going back and throwing the Alabama rig a little bit. I kind of put it away for several years just because I got tired of throwing it. I threw it so much, and there was a lot of negativity around it, so I just kind of kept it out of videos. But I want to get back to throwing it a little bit just because I haven't thrown it that much. And I also wanted to try out these new Core Tackle tush hooks we put out, which is a 1/16 and 1/8 ounce 2/0 tush hook, which we made specifically for this umbrella rig. It's a really cool little hook that allows you to hide all of the weight inside of that soft plastic swim bait. And I think it could work really well in that A-rig, so I want to give those a try as well. Got a few other baits over here. Got a little bit lighter Demiki rig, which is actually using the new Core Tackle finesse tush hook that we have not released yet. We're still in the process of kind of prototyping it, which is a cool little rig, and I'll talk about that a little bit more as those come out. And then I also got a Core Tackle hover rig over here, just in case I find some fish that are suspended higher up in the water column. So I wanted to give you guys a little bit of an insight as to what I'm thinking about in terms of baits and stuff when they go to the lake. And hopefully in this video, you learned a little bit more about how I think about adjusting to the conditions that I face on the lake. One thing about having an app like the Deep Dive app, which is really valuable, is it gives you that macro view of the lake from the water level, the current flow, the water clarity with the water clarity graphs we have, as well as the wind impacts. By taking a look at some of these macro elements when you're having a tough fishing day, you can oftentimes open up your mind to new possibilities and make adjustments based on past experience and instinct to put some really nice fish in the boat. Don't just keep pounding your head against the wall if you're struggling on the lake. If your pattern or your plan isn't working in the first couple of hours, make an audible. Sit down, check out some of the resources you have available, your contour maps, graphs, things like that, and try to formulate a new game plan with a fresh mind. Most of the time, it's going to result in some really good fish catches. As long as you trust your gut, you're gonna have a lot of success. Hopefully you guys enjoyed this video. We'll see you on the next one.